The door shattered against its frame as Karen stormed inside, fury dripping from every step, convinced she had cornered the man she despised. But on the worn sofa sat a stranger, calm, silent, a badge glinting faintly on his chest, watching every move with eyes that carried the weight of power. In that instant, her war over a lake cabin had turned into something far darker than she ever imagined. Before the storm of betrayal, corruption, and justice unfolds, make sure to like this video and comment where you're watching from so we know who's standing with us in this fight. Karen slams through the door, talking about community control and fine stacking. One officer squares up, the other hangs back. On the sofa, a calm man sits with a badge pinned steady, studying her like he has seen this before. Karen demands the dock surrendered by sundown. I say the cease and desist is filed and the county seal is fresh. Karen laughs, claims emergency lake management puts everything under the board. The badge asks who signed the order. Karen throws out nuisance and noncompliance like shields. He introduces himself, senior advisor sent to evaluate interference after complaints piled high. Karen stumbles over his title, then smiles. I say Dad's permit is paid and preserved, the dock lawful, the ledger intact. The eager officer snaps that none of this matters if the board controls codes. Karen slips and boasts about holding the master codes, says locks were reconfigured for safety and one person keeps the master. The advisor writes one word: unlawful. The cautious officer asks who authorized that consolidation. I say removal from my own cabin would be a mistake with a long trail. The advisor says chain of custody comes first for contested devices. Karen scoffs, claims her files are in the truck, then clutches the tablet tighter. Karen smirks and says policy is enough when a resident refuses. Her tablet pings. A message flashes. Stall him. The advisor asks who Harbor Group is and why a board takes instructions from them. Karen calls it a vendor and nothing more, but her thumb hovers, the screen pulsing like a heartbeat. I remind the room this is my home and my father's permit stand. If this fight has touched your life, tap like and share where you're watching from so more eyes stay on this. Karen calls that theatrics and says the board does not answer to an audience. The advisor says it will answer to records. He asks again who signed the dredge plan. I slide a folder across the table. County letter, notice, fine totals that do not match the ledger residents paid into. The cautious officer reads, and his mouth tightens. Karen pivots to a wildlife excuse, says boats damaged nests. The advisor asks if the complaint came before or after the developer proposal. Karen says there was no proposal and holds eye contact too long. The advisor asks for the incident number for tonight. Karen lists violations again, faster now, like outrunning a train already behind her. The advisor lifts a hand and asks for the tablet. Chain of custody, a simple step. Karen freezes. The eager officer says she does not have to hand over anything. The advisor reminds him what obstruction sounds like on a recording. Karen extends the tablet halfway, then jerks it back. Her knuckles blanch. Karen offers to email everything later. The advisor says later is where files disappear. Her thumb traces a practiced pattern across the glass. The cautious officer inches forward. The eager one hardens his stance. The advisor says now. Karen's eyes flick to exit. She tilts the tablet, palm hiding the corner where the destroy command sleeps. Menu blooms, and her thumb hovers. The cautious officer reaches. The eager one barks that this interview is over. Karen's breath catches. Something priceless sits one touch from vanishing. What is she so desperate to erase? The room thickened with tension as Karen's thumb lingered above the tablet like a blade about to fall. The advisor's voice cut through the silence with iron precision, demanding the device now. Karen clutched it closer, snapping that the HOA does not answer to outsiders. Her bravado cracked when I opened the old tackle box and laid down a leather ledger worn from my father's hands. Every page was a scar, every inked number a story of money drained from families who trusted the board. Karen's smile faltered. She tried to laugh, but her laugh trembled. The advisor leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the ledger, asking where these numbers came from. I told him they were payments marked as environmental fees, but the bank receipts tell another story. They trail into a nonprofit no one in this town had ever heard of. Karen's face stiffened. She barked that those were donations, voluntary contributions. My voice cut sharper, naming families who had emptied savings to pay them, believing they were helping preserve the lake. families still waiting for refunds while the shoreline crumbled. The eager officer grew restless, shifting, muttering that this is civil business, not criminal. The advisor reminded him that embezzlement doesn't wear a polite mask. Karen crossed her arms, scoffing, but her tablet betrayed her. A vibration buzzed across the wood, and a message flashed across the screen. Stall him. The advisor's hand froze over the words. He demanded to know who Harbor Group was and why a supposed nonprofit was ordering an elected board president to stall a federal inquiry. Karen's breath caught before she claimed it was a vendor, a maintenance group, nothing more. Her voice cracked on the last word. The cautious officer frowned, muttering that vendors don't order presidents around. Karen snapped that she owed no explanations, but her hand trembled as she swiped the screen away. The advisor's recorder blinked red, capturing every syllable. Karen leaned hard into the table, spitting that the community voted her in and she doesn't scare easily. I told her fear has nothing to do with this, truth does. The ledger sat between us like a weapon, daring her to deny the figures inked by my father's hand. She lashed back with venom, claiming my father had manipulated the books, that he was no hero, only a bitter man clinging to a dock he didn't deserve. For the first time, my chest burned hotter than rage. The advisor's brow furrowed. He asked if she was certain about accusing a dead man, because forged receipts don't argue back, they convict. Karen's eyes darted to the eager officer, searching for support. He only shook his head, sweat rising as the words embezzlement and federal crime began to echo. The ledger flipped to another page, one marked with a series of cash withdrawals aligning perfectly with HOA fine payments. The cautious officer whispered that the numbers matched exactly. Karen slammed her hand down, shouting that none of this proves she pocketed anything. Her voice cracked again, breaking into a shrill edge. The advisor asked why her name appeared as treasurer on a shell nonprofit registered to a vacant warehouse. Karen's lips pressed tight. No answer, just the sound of silence closing in. Before anyone could press further, headlights swept across the window, and the distant crunch of tires broke through. A car door slammed. The cautious officer reached instinctively for his sidearm, while Karen's face drained pale. The advisor asked if she was expecting company. She shook her head, too quickly, too nervously. The eager officer muttered something under his breath about property inspection, but even he didn't sound convinced. The ledger lay open on the table, damning and undeniable, while outside footsteps approached with steady confidence. The door opened without a knock. A man walked in as though he owned the floorboards, tailored suit sharp, smile sharper, holding himself like the cabin already belonged to him. He didn't glance at Karen or the officers first. His eyes locked on the ledger, then flicked to the advisor's badge. He smiled wider. Karen exhaled in relief, calling him a friend of the community. He corrected her softly, saying he was no friend, he was a partner, and partnerships come with expectations. The advisor rose, asking his name, his affiliation. He simply said Harbor Group, the same Harbor Group that had just ordered Karen to stall. His calm was more dangerous than her fury. He reached into his pocket and laid a folded document on the table, announcing it was an offer to buy the shoreline rights tonight, signatures ready, money already wired. Karen's eyes gleamed, calling it a miracle solution. The cautious officer whispered it wasn't legal. The eager officer stayed quiet, fists tight. The advisor leaned in, asking what Harbor Group truly wanted. The man only smirked and said sometimes accidents happen to stubborn people. The words hung like smoke. The ledger trembled under my hand. And that was when the smile cut deeper. The man leaned close enough for Karen alone to hear, but everyone caught the words. Your father knew the rules. He paid. That's why his fight ended the way it did. My chest tightened. My father had died holding this cabin against the storm, and this man dared to say it was a payment. He leaned back, his voice casual, and named a hospital wing. He named my sister's shift time. And suddenly, the room froze. Who had given him her schedule? The air snapped like glass when the man uttered her hospital wing and shift time. Karen froze, her bravado collapsing into confusion, while the officers stiffened. The advisor's jaw tightened, asking how Harbor Group knew private details of a nurse not tied to any board. The man leaned back casually, saying information was currency, and those who refused to sell property often paid with blood instead. His smile was soft, but every word cut like a blade. Karen's eyes darted between him and the badge, torn between loyalty and fear. He slid the folded contract further across the table, tapping the blank signature line. He said tonight could end clean if the rights were signed. Karen whispered this was the solution the board had been waiting for, a miracle that would shut down complaints. The advisor cut her off, demanding a copy of the dredging permits that supposedly allowed this deal. The man chuckled, saying permits come after signatures, not before. He added that stubborn people who question the order of things tend to lose the things they love most. His eyes flicked back to me, daring me to blink. The eager officer shifted, palming his baton like a man ready to choose sides. The cautious officer whispered that this was extortion, plain and simple. The harbor man smirked and reminded him that his paycheck came from hazard funds buried inside those very accounts. Karen gasped, realizing the officer's loyalty wasn't civic, it was financial. The officer clenched his jaw but didn't deny it. The advisor pressed the record button harder, voice steady, noting that intimidation of witnesses is a federal offense. The harbor man leaned closer, lowering his voice to a velvet threat. Accidents happen to stubborn people. Accidents happen to their families too. The words sliced open a memory of my father refusing to leave the cabin. He had been told the same thing in softer tones, and months later, he was gone. The harbor man's smirk confirmed what I had long suspected. Dad didn't just die. He was erased for standing ground. My fists tightened, but before rage could break through, I pulled a phone from my pocket. I tapped play on a voice memo, and Karen's own voice filled the room. Her tone was sharp, staging fake wildlife complaints, rehearsing lines to find families who never broke rules. She tried to shout it down, claiming edits, manipulation, lies, but her eyes betrayed her. The cautious officer stepped back, shocked. Before she could scramble, my phone buzzed. A photo lit up the screen. My sister had sent a cashier's check. Her message was one line. Same nonprofit. Same signature. The name across the check matched the shell account that bled residents dry. The harbor man's eyes flicked to Karen, then back to me. He laughed, slow and cold, saying she was clumsier than he expected. Karen shouted for him to stop, voice cracking. She begged the officers not to believe what they saw, that this was taken out of context. But her hands shook so violently, her words collapsed under the weight of evidence. The advisor's voice grew sharper, asking if Karen admitted collusion with Harbor Group. She fired back, saying everything she did was to save the community, to bring order to chaos. She accused me of turning neighbors against her, of weaponizing grief to keep a cabin that belonged to the board. My laugh was bitter. I told her the ledger wasn't grief, it was fact, and the voices she silenced were about to echo louder than she ever imagined. The harbor man smiled again, cutting through the clash with a whisper. Your father fought too. Look what it bought him. That broke me. Rage boiled, grief ignited. But before I could strike, the harbor man leaned close enough for only me to hear, but loud enough that everyone caught the gist. He named my sister's hospital floor. He described the color of her scrubs. He said the shift ended at midnight, and people get careless in parking lots. My blood turned to stone. Karen gasped, realizing just how deep she had sunk, aligning herself with men who weaponize family as casually as paper contracts. The advisor stepped between us, badge gleaming, voice iron. He warned Harbor that this recording would leave the cabin in 30 seconds whether he stayed or walked out. The harbor man only smiled wider, saying sometimes it doesn't matter what's recorded, only who controls the fire that erases it. His words curled like smoke, daring the flame to begin. If you've ever had to choose between silence and standing tall when they threaten what you love most, drop a heart in the comments so the world knows you wouldn't fold. Because in that room, every heartbeat knew one thing. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about survival. And survival always comes with a cost. The harbor man leaned back in the chair, calm as ever, and asked the question no one wanted to answer. Who here is ready to pay it? The harbor man's question tore through the cabin, leaving silence that burned hotter than fire. Karen stammered that she never signed up for this, her voice cracking with fear now instead of authority. The advisor rose slowly, shoulders squared, the weight of Washington heavy in his voice. Intimidation of a witness is federal, he said, and every second of this was now preserved on a secure channel. The cautious officer stepped forward, siding with the badge for the first time. The eager officer snapped, his hand dropping to his weapon, spitting that I was trespassing in my own home. The lie cracked the air in half. Karen lunged for the ledger as if tearing a page could erase the truth. The binding ripped, and a hidden envelope slid free, scattering papers across the floor. They weren't bills or receipts. They were photocopies of ballots from the last HOA election. Names repeated, signatures forged in the same pen. The advisor froze, his eyes narrowing as he whispered one of the names aloud, a federal employee attached to community grants. Karen's face drained white as chalk. She screamed that those were clerical copies, nothing more, but even her voice shook with guilt. The harbor man didn't flinch. He only smirked, as though every forged ballot was part of his design. He told Karen to calm down. That panic makes enemies obvious. Karen spun on him, betrayal flashing in her eyes, shouting that he promised protection. He leaned closer, voice low, reminding her that protection costs loyalty, and loyalty doesn't come free. Her hands trembled, clutching the torn envelope like it could shield her from the truth bleeding out of it. The cautious officer bent to pick up one of the ballots, his eyes locking on the matching signatures. His voice cracked when he admitted he knew two of the families personally, and none of them had ever voted for Karen. The advisor nodded, voice hard as steel, saying this wasn't just corruption. It was election fraud tied directly to federal funds. Karen shouted that she had no choice, that the community demanded order. Her words spilled like desperation, each syllable a confession she couldn't claw back. The eager officer barked that enough was enough, his gun hand twitching, accusing the advisor of interfering in local authority. The advisor turned calmly, saying federal jurisdiction outranks desperation. The harbor man watched like a spectator at a show he scripted, smiling as the cracks widened. He whispered to Karen that if she wanted to keep her child, she should remember who her real ally was. Tears welled in her eyes, rage clashing with grief as she cursed him for dragging her into this mess. I stepped forward, voice rising, reminding her of every neighbor fined into bankruptcy, every family forced to sell, every lie inked onto those ballots. She covered her ears, shaking her head, screaming that it wasn't supposed to end like this. The advisor cut her off, demanding she hand over the device now. She clutched it tighter, her thumb trembling over the screen, hovering over the self-destruct command like she was deciding between her future and her survival. The cautious officer reached out carefully, urging her to stop before she crossed the last line. She jerked away, sobbing, her back against the wall. The harbor man smiled wider, whispering that sometimes burning the evidence is the only way to live. Karen's breath hitched, torn between his voice and the truth unraveling in her hands. She screamed that none of this would matter once the board rebuilt the lake, once the contracts cleared. The advisor cut her off coldly, reminding her that contracts forged on blood always end in prison. She shook her head violently, then raised the tablet higher like a weapon, thumb poised to erase everything. The air snapped again when headlights flared through the window. An engine revved outside, louder than thunder. Tires crunched over gravel as another vehicle pulled close, flooding the room with white light. The cautious officer turned, hand on his holster, nerves raw. The harbor man didn't even flinch. He leaned back in the chair, satisfied, as if the next act was already written. Karen gasped, her thumb still hovering, torn between fear of prison and fear of what waited outside. The advisor's voice cut sharp, ordering everyone to hold position. But outside, in the crushing dark, a shotgun racked a shell with chilling certainty. And the next breath everyone took felt like it could be their last. The sound of the shotgun outside shattered the room into chaos. Karen screamed and ducked low, clutching the tablet like a lifeline. The cautious officer drew his sidearm, shouting warnings, while the eager one barked that this was official enforcement and no one should interfere. The advisor's voice cut through like steel, ordering everyone to keep steady. The harbor man leaned back in his chair, smirking, as if he had orchestrated the echo of that pump action. Then came the pounding on the door. A booming voice called it a lake patrol inspection, but the advisor's brow tightened, catching the false authority. The cautious officer glanced nervously, realizing no lake patrol carried shotguns. My fists clenched as I stepped toward the mantel and reached for my father's flare gun, the old weapon that had never left this cabin. Karen shrieked at the sight of it, shouting that I was threatening community officers. I told her this wasn't community law anymore. This was survival. The door rattled. A blast shattered with chips across the floor, buckshot tearing through the frame. The cautious officer fired a warning shot into the gravel, shouting at whoever stood outside to stand down. Karen clutched her head, screaming that this was all blown out of proportion. The harbor man just laughed under his breath, whispering that pressure makes truth bleed out faster. The advisor barked into his recorder that the assault was now armed interference with federal investigation. His calm was terrifying, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. Karen staggered to her feet, tears streaking down her face. She screamed that the board never meant for this to happen, that Harbor promised protection and prosperity. The harbor man sneered, asking her if she really thought contracts come without consequences. He reminded her again about her child, twisting the knife. She collapsed against the wall, clutching the tablet tighter, her thumb dancing desperately over the screen like she could delete the evidence and erase her guilt in one motion. Another gunshot boomed, shattering a lamp, sending everyone scattering. The cautious officer cursed, firing another round outside, while the eager officer shouted that this was his jurisdiction, not Washington's. The advisor stepped forward, voice sharp, declaring that obstruction and assault would put every name in that ledger under federal indictment. Karen howled that she never signed up for this war, that she only wanted order. Her voice broke, sobbing, pleading that she had done it to keep her custody petition alive, to keep her child from being taken. The admission spilled raw and unfiltered, echoing across the room. The harbor man clapped slowly, mocking her confession, saying desperation is always the easiest currency to spend. He leaned forward, telling the officers that chaos was proof they needed stronger oversight, a board with absolute control, and Karen had delivered it perfectly. The eager officer nodded, almost buying it, until the cautious one shouted that forged ballots and embezzled funds were not oversight but theft. Their standoff hung razor-thin, guns drawn, loyalties fractured. And then my phone lit up again. My sister's name filled the screen. I answered on speaker, her voice trembling, tears cutting through every word. She said someone had tried to pull her bank records, not from the hospital, but from a shell account that matched the nonprofit. She choked on her words, whispering that the signature wasn't Karen's married name, but her maiden one. The room froze. The evidence was no longer just numbers in a ledger. It was living proof of identity, tied directly to her. Karen screamed that it was impossible, denying it with every breath, but her face betrayed the truth. The advisor snapped his eyes to Karen, demanding an explanation. She sobbed, saying she only signed once, that Harbor told her it would cover old debts, that no one would ever see it. The harbor man grinned wider, confirming what we all knew, that he had used her desperation like a hammer. He said the HOA was never about order, it was about leverage, and now the board was a weapon he controlled. Karen screamed at him, voice cracking, shouting that he had promised her protection. He only leaned closer, whispering that protection doesn't exist when the fire's already inside your home. The cautious officer's voice rose in fury, declaring that this was corruption, plain and simple. He raised his weapon, trembling but firm, pointing it at the harbor man. The eager officer snapped, gun raised toward me, screaming that I was the one provoking this war. Two barrels pointed in opposite directions, one moment away from tragedy. The advisor's voice thundered like a hammer, ordering everyone to lower their weapons before lives were lost. But outside, the engine revved louder, the shotgun pumped again, and footsteps scraped against the gravel, closing in. The room held its breath, every soul inside knowing one misstep would ignite the firestorm. The standoff cracked open with voices colliding, but the advisor's command cut sharp as a blade. He demanded silence, then called out names from the ledger, cross-referencing the nonprofit with shell corporations. Every name connected like wires in a bomb. He declared Harbor Group's treasurer was no stranger at all but the developer's own cousin, pulling strings behind every fraudulent ballot. The cautious officer's jaw dropped as he realized his hazard pay had been laundered through the same channels. He whispered that every dollar he had taken was soaked in theft. His gun hand shook, guilt carving deeper than fear. Karen collapsed to her knees, sobbing that she hadn't known it would spread this far. She admitted she only wanted enough money to erase the DUI that threatened her custody fight, to hold on to her child. Her voice tore through the cabin, raw with desperation, blaming herself for trusting men who promised her power in exchange for silence. The harbor man sneered, calling her weakness predictable, mocking her tears as cheap currency. His words dripped with venom as he reminded her that the HOA wasn't about families, it was about leverage. The advisor snapped back, voice trembling with fury, that children should never be pawns in any war. Karen screamed at him not to pretend he understood, shouting that the board was the only chance she had left. She clutched the tablet like a lifeline, begging for mercy, begging for time. The cautious officer's voice cracked as he urged her to stop before she buried herself deeper. The eager officer barked that none of it mattered, that property law was on the board's side. But the advisor roared back, declaring federal jurisdiction, daring anyone to challenge him. The harbor man laughed, saying paperwork doesn't matter when fear writes the contracts. The air split again when sirens rose in the distance. Red and blue lights flickered faintly, growing stronger by the second. Karen's eyes widened with dread. She whispered that they couldn't find her like this, that she would lose everything. She bolted for the back door, clutching the tablet, but I blocked her path. Her eyes locked on mine, pleading, begging that I let her go. Tears ran down her cheeks as she confessed the DUI, the fear of losing her child, the deal she struck with Harbor just to keep her family intact. Her voice cracked so violently it stabbed everyone in the room. The advisor told her survival never comes through lies, that she had to face the fire before it consumed her. She dropped to the floor, sobbing, confessing to ballot forgery, to payments hidden under nonprofit stamps, to lies sold as order. Every word bled into the recorder, sealing her fate. The harbor man clapped slowly, grinning, saying her honesty was too late. He pulled a thumb drive from his coat and flicked it into the fireplace. It landed in the embers, glowing faintly, its secrets beginning to burn. He smirked, certain that the evidence was now nothing but ash. But the advisor's eyes flicked upward to the mantel. A small recording device blinked steadily, capturing every second. His lips curled into the faintest smile. The harbor man hadn't destroyed the truth. He had only revealed his own desperation. The cautious officer lunged for the fireplace, trying to pull the drive free, but the harbor man shoved him back, shouting that no one could touch it. I grabbed the tongs, fishing it from the heat, smoke curling off its surface. Karen screamed that it was useless, that the files were already corrupted. The advisor stared at the charred device and said even a single surviving fragment could unravel everything. The harbor man snarled, calling it bluff, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed him. He lunged, trying to seize it, but the cautious officer pinned him down, trembling with the weight of his own betrayal. Karen sobbed uncontrollably, rocking on the floor, whispering apologies she could never take back. The eager officer still held his weapon on me, voice cracking now, saying this was chaos and someone had to end it. The advisor stared him down, warning that pulling that trigger would bury him with Harbor. The eager officer's face twisted, sweat dripping, torn between loyalty to corruption and the truth glaring in front of him. His hand trembled harder. Karen screamed at him not to let her go to prison, begging him to erase the evidence, to protect her child. He shouted back that he couldn't carry her lies anymore. Outside, the sirens grew louder, gravel crunching under the weight of incoming vehicles. Karen's sobs rose to hysteria as the harbor man roared, promising everyone in the room would burn before he fell. He spat that no advisor, no badge, no federal order could stop him from owning this lake. His words cracked with rage, his mask finally slipping. The advisor raised his badge high, declaring the room under federal authority. And at that exact moment, the front door shook violently, flashlights slicing through the cracks, voices shouting commands. Karen's scream pierced the chaos. The harbor man twisted, knocking over the table, lunging one last time. And the thumb drive, still warm from the fire, slipped from my hands and clattered across the floor, glowing faintly as boots thundered closer. Would it survive the flames? Or had the truth already been reduced to ash? The cabin erupted as boots stormed through the doorway, voices shouting orders, weapons raised, flashlights cutting across terrified faces. The harbor man lunged for the thumb drive, but the cautious officer slammed him against the floor, finally choosing a side. Karen screamed that it was over, her voice raw, begging them not to let the world see what she had done. The eager officer raised his weapon, hands trembling, but the advisor roared at him to stand down. For a heartbeat, no one breathed, the weight of justice and betrayal pressing down like a thunderstorm. The drive clattered across the floor, still smoking from the embers, its plastic warped but intact. One of the federal agents scooped it up with gloved hands, bagging it like a relic. The harbor man cursed, thrashing against the officer's grip, shouting that it was worthless, that nothing survived fire. The advisor's voice cut cold, saying sometimes truth survives because it refuses to die. Karen broke into sobs, whispering that she never wanted it this way, that she only wanted her child safe. Her cries were jagged, torn between guilt and fear, her voice collapsing under the weight of her choices. The eager officer's gun still wavered, pointed squarely at me, his face drenched in sweat. He muttered that the board was his livelihood, that without it he had nothing left. The cautious officer shouted that their pay was stolen money, laundered through lies, and that every round he fired tonight would chain him to Harbor's crimes. The eager officer's breath hitched, his finger tightening, his world collapsing around him. Then his arm dropped. The gun clattered to the floor. His knees buckled as he muttered that he couldn't live with it anymore. His confession rang louder than a bullet. The advisor pressed forward, demanding statements, demanding chain of custody, making sure every word Karen sobbed and every curse Harbor spat was locked into the record. The federal agents snapped restraints on the harbor man, who still smirked as though prison meant nothing. He hissed that he had backups, that Harbor Group was more than one drive, more than one man. The advisor leaned close and whispered that every empire believes it is untouchable until it crumbles. The harbor man's smirk faltered, just for a second, and that second was enough. Karen tore the HOA pin from her blouse and hurled it across the room. She cried out that she had destroyed everything, that she had betrayed her neighbors, that she had sacrificed her soul for a deal that only broke her. Her words cut deep, leaving everyone in silence. She begged for one more chance, swearing she would fight for her child the right way. The advisor nodded slowly, saying justice wasn't about erasing sins but facing them. Her sobs echoed as agents led her out in cuffs, her eyes never leaving the floor, her body trembling under the weight of her downfall. The harbor man spat promises of revenge as he was dragged out, but the ledger sat on the table, proof of everything. I lifted it gently, the same ledger my father had carried through storms, the same ledger that told the story of neighbors bled dry by greed. My chest tightened with grief and pride, knowing his fight hadn't ended in silence. The advisor nodded at me, his voice softer now, saying some battles are fought for land, but won for people. I felt my father's presence in that moment, like the cabin itself breathed his spirit back into the room. The cautious officer dropped his weapon and raised his hands, confessing on record that he had known, that he had looked the other way, that guilt had eaten him alive. His voice cracked as he begged for forgiveness, tears streaming down his face. The advisor recorded it all, his voice steady as he promised that confession would carry weight in the days ahead. The eager officer sat against the wall, head in his hands, broken by the realization that loyalty to corruption had nearly destroyed him. Their silence told the story of men who finally saw the truth too late. The federal agents cleared the room, securing evidence, sealing every word into the chain. The thumb drive was bagged, the ledger preserved, the voice recordings sent up the line. The weight of months of lies and years of greed finally cracked open, spilling into the light. Karen's sobs faded as the doors shut behind her. The harbor man's threats were swallowed by the night. All that remained was the echo of my father's fight, his legacy inked across those pages. Weeks later, the county voided the fraudulent fines. Families received refunds, neighbors returned to their homes, and the lake returned to those who belonged. The dock stood unbroken, a testament to a promise kept. We hosted a children's fishing day in my father's name, laughter rising where fear once ruled. The advisor left his card, telling me the fight wasn't just about one cabin. It was about every family who refused to bend to corruption. He gave a nod, a silent acknowledgement of a war ended with truth. Karen watched from the cruiser window that night, tears cutting down her face, mouthing an apology no one could hear. The harbor man's smirk finally cracked as the badge pressed down harder than his empire could hold. And as the lake fell still, I realized the war was over. The ledger was back on the shelf. The cabin was safe. My father's fight lived on. If this story gave you strength when someone tried to take what's yours, like this video, share it, and subscribe so these battles aren't fought in the dark. And tell me in the comments who you'd stand up for, because tonight proved one thing. Silence lets them win, but courage writes the ending.